Hello, Luigi.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Perfect. Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Miguel. I'm
Hi.
gonna be
Yeah.
chairing your meeting today.
Miguel from Spain, I guess.
From Spain, based in Brighton, but from Spain, yeah.
Okay, nice.
How about you?
Where in Spain,
Italian, I
if I may?
assume? I'm from
Yeah,
Barcelona.
Italy. Barcelona. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Italian. Yeah.
Whereabouts are you from?
Italy. I'm from Torino, originally.
Okay, nice, nice.
Yeah, it's northwest Italy.
Nice. Okay, I see Carl is around here. Do you mind trying to share your screen just to check that everything is working
Yeah,
fine? Thank you.
sure. Can you see it?
Yeah. Perfect, perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I guess don't see a few people around already. So I guess then we can start with you. So Luigi Grisoni today is going to be talking about predictive activity in language processing. So yeah, feel free to start. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you for the nice invitation. I'm happy to present here. So I briefly introduce myself. I'm Luigi Grisoni. I worked for nearly 15 years in Berlin at the Freie Universität and the Brain Language Laboratory with Professor Friedman Pulvermüller. But recently I moved back to Italy after many years abroad at the Italian Institute of Technology, which is based, so our institution, specific institution, is based within the University of Ferrara. And this research institute is coordinated by Professor Fadiga, Luciano Fadiga, and Alessandro D'Ausilio. And it's a great environment. I'm very happy to work there. And my main focus is about language processing, and in particular, with a focus on predictive activity in language processing. So today I'll give you an overview of my previous study. I really hope that this will be of interest for you, but I hope so. So when we look at language, I think that a very good starting point is to consider the very first distinction one could make, which is between speech production and speech comprehension. Because obviously language is something we can produce, but it's something we can also understand, process as input when we hear, listen, or read written language. Now, traditionally, these two modalities have been considered segregated. For example, the 19th centuries of physiology suggested two distinct centers in the brain with frontal areas mostly involved in speech production and posterior temporal areas in language understanding. Now, this strict separation did not survive, but still today persists some sort, or to a certain degree, a partial separation between these two modalities. For example, if we consider the well-known and important dual stream model by Hickok and Pöppel, we have an asymmetry in space between the two modalities, with the posterior temporal areas being relevant in both modalities, comprehension and production, but the frontal part being particularly relevant for language production more than comprehension. Now, this asymmetry doesn't pertain just only the space domain, but also the temporal domain. This is the case of the serial cascade models, according to which these two modalities are carried out in the brain by a series of steps, cognitive steps. For example, if we might consider language production, picture naming, there is usually a first conceptual part, and then step by step, the brain arrives to the final articulation. And this interval and all this serial process takes up to 600 or 800 milliseconds, so quite substantial timing. Furthermore, in these models, usually, it is also supposed that the two modalities differ for the order of the processing. So while in production, it is assumed that the brain starts from the conceptual representation and then finally arrive to articulation. In comprehension is supposed to happen the opposite, the reverse order. So first there is an analysis of perceptual input, visual in case of written words, or acoustic signals in case of spoken words. And then the final step is the conceptual, the semantic elaboration, the conceptual processing and pragmatics as well. So one alternative way of looking at the modality is by considering distributed neural networks in brain. And according to this framework, we have one distributed network which is relevant, one representation unit which is modality independent and ignite very early within 200 milliseconds and support both modalities, so comprehension and production. So to give you a better idea of this approach, we might consider, for example, a very specific semantic category, action-related words such as walk, drink, and so on. When we learn these words in our childhood, typically we do in a context in which we perceive someone performing these actions, or in a condition in which ourselves are performing these actions. So we have a pattern of activity in the motor system. But since we are also learning a new word, we are also pronouncing or hearing the word we are learning. So there is a second patterns of activity in perisylvian brain areas, superior temporal, articulatory motor brain areas. Now, as effect of associative Hebbian-like learning, neurons that fire together, wired together, we have the emergence of cell assemblies, distributed cell assemblies in which all these neurons are linked and represent the learned item. In this case, for this specific example, action-related word. Now, obviously, this approach also, these distributed networks can shape their specific topography by depending on specific information. For example, in case of action-related words, we have that depending on the factor involved in the action depicted by the learned word, one might expect specific pattern of activation according to the somatotopic organization of these areas that is very ventral in case of face-related words such as eat or drink, and then more dorsal for arm and most dorsal for leg words such as walk or run, for example. Now, the very same logic can also extend, obviously, to other concrete semantic categories. For example, in case of visually related words, we have that the semantic information is also encoded in a visual modality preferential visual areas, that is in ventral posterior brain regions, because these areas are the most important one to codify the visual information. So visually related words such as color, form, but in general, all those semantic categories for which the visual information is an important component of the meaning might activate additional activity, might show additional activity in posterior and ventral visual areas. For example, has been demonstrated also animal nouns, because visual information is also in that case an important representation. So as I was saying, this model then would predict that these distributed networks, which are also discrete in the sense that depending on the specific information they codify, are slightly different. But the idea is that there is one representation unit which is active, that ignite near simultaneously in the two modalities, in comprehension and production. So to test these and contrast these hypotheses, we perform a study, quite complex, a 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 design, in which we contrasted 3 different levels, linguistic levels, phonological levels, so words either starting with labial phonemes, so lips-related phonemes, such as b, p, versus words starting with coronal phonemes, d, t, so tongue-related sounds. Then for the semantic level, we focus on 2 concrete semantic categories, which are probably the 2 most semantic categories in the literature, so animal and tool nouns. And finally, we also tested the pragmatic levels, in this case by contrasting 2 different speech acts, that is naming and requesting, because obviously one could either pronounce or perceive a word in a context in which the object depicted by the word is requested, or just name. So I might pronounce the word hammer to teach my young daughter that that object is named hammer, or in a different context, I might pronounce the word hammer to request the hammer because I need to accomplish some task. And obviously, we contrasted the 2 modalities, comprehension and production. So the same participant underwent 2 experiments, one comprehension experiment in which written words were presented, assayed. These words could either start with labial or coronal phonemes, so lips or tongue-related phonemes, belonging to 2 possible semantic categories, either animal or tool nouns, in a context of naming, which was operationalized here with these hand gestures, or requesting condition, because these hand gestures have been already used in previous studies and has been already demonstrated that they can trigger the different speech acts, contextual, communicative intention. Now, in the production experiment, it was the same experiment, the same structure, just instead of the written words, we presented pictures, and participants had the corresponding pictures, obviously, of the written words, and participants had to name the pictures. So it was a simple picture naming task. Now, if we look at our partial separation or modular-like accounts, this would predict already early 4-way interactions with the modality and the linguistic levels because of the spread effect of processing in these 2 modalities, and quite different, distinct processing underlying the 2 modalities. Vice versa, in the parallel network accounts, would predict not any early modality by linguistic interaction, but instead would predict the 3-way interactions of pragmatics, semantics, and phonology, but without modality, especially at very early latency, so within 200 milliseconds, because according to this network, there are specific neural representation units which subserve these different levels, but at very early latencies, their effect is statistically indistinguishable between the 2 modalities. So this was obviously, as I mentioned, as you can see here, an EEG study. And what we observe, so here are the ERPs for the conditions. We observe at the very early, ultra early latency, between 50 and 90 milliseconds, or within 100 milliseconds, an effect of modality, which, however, did not interact with our linguistic levels. It was just interacted with the topographical factor, gradient, anterior, posterior, laterality, left and right. And in particular, so the two modality differed here in the posterior and ventral electrode, but this is trivially explainable because the stimuli used were substantially different. So written words in comprehension versus pictures in production. Crucially, within 200 milliseconds, we observed a three-way interaction, so pragmatics, semantics, and phonology, with also the additional factor, topographical factor, in this case laterality, which is consistent so with the existence of a representation unit, which is discrete, so different depending on the specific information at the pragmatic, semantics, and phonological level, but which support both modalities, so comprehension and production. Obviously, we observe at later latencies in the range of the N400, also a modulation, so that modality jumped in and interacted with all the linguistic factors. But obviously at these later latencies, it makes sense that the two modalities differ because in comprehension, there might be the activity might start to decay. In production, might still be active due to the fact that participants are indeed pronouncing the word, and so on. There might be also other more peripheral, if you want, differences between the two modalities. But if we look again also at source estimations, we observe that at these early latencies, so within 200 milliseconds, the two action-related conditions which were requested for the pragmatic level and the tools for the semantic levels also show greater activity in prefrontal motor brain regions as compared to the non-action related conditions, which in turn, which were naming for the pragmatics and animal nouns for the semantic, which show vice versa greater activity in posterior visual brain areas. Okay, so the involvement of modality preferential brain areas in language processing has been demonstrated by many other several studies with different techniques and behavioral also studies. But what I think is also important is to test whether the activity in modality preferential brain areas, for example, motor system in case of action-related stimuli, also show flexible patterns of activity. Because we know that language is a flexible process, so that means that it's influenced also by contextual information apart that single word. And in one specific study, we investigated what could be considered maybe the most famous and important effect of flexibility, which is priming effect. And in particular, we asked ourselves whether semantic priming can be mediated by the motor system when obviously the relevant information is action related. So to this end, we investigated in a study the mismatch negativity. You are probably familiar with the mismatch negativity. Professor Friesman did very important contribution in this field as well. And mismatch negativity, briefly to introduce the marker, is elicited by violations of auditory regularity. So we have this redundant, repetitive, also boring acoustic stimulation. One sound is repeated many times. And then when a new sound, a deviant sound is presented, there is this larger mismatch negativity. So in this study, it was a cross-modal priming study because as a standard sounds, we used action sounds, so not action words. In particular, we tested whistles, so lips-related sounds, and footsteps, leg-related sounds. And then as deviant events, so the rarely occurring, unpredictable, deviant sounds, we presented spoken word. And in particular, we presented two action-related words, kiss and kick, which then were presented in a body part congruent condition. So kiss in the context of whistles, because they both share the lips effector, and kick in the context of footsteps, because they both share the leg lower limb effector. Then this was a fully orthogonal design, so we also presented the very same word in the body part incongruent conditions, that is kick in the context of whistle sound and kiss in the context of footsteps sound. So what we observe is that these are the ERPs elicited by the word, here kick, here kiss. This is the word onset, and at the latency, which was also consistent with the word recognition point, because obviously the very first part of the word was very similar. It was the k sound. And then at the latency, which was consistent with the word recognition point, we observe a modulation, which is consistent with semantic priming, that is larger brain responses for incongruent conditions, pairs, as compared to the congruent ones. And we also revealed that part of these modulations came from the motor system, and in particular from specific subregions, particularly in ventral motor regions for kiss, lips-related words, but in dorsal regions for kick, lower leg-related stimuli. Okay, so this was an example that this activity, so the role of motor system in language processing is not just a fixed role, but it's also show modulations depending, which are consistent with the contextual information. And it's the kind of feature that one would expect for a genuine role in language processing, in this specific case at the semantic level. But another important, maybe also especially in this context, evidence or important case for flexibility is prediction. And also this is important if we look at how the motor system behave in its traditional, if you want, function, that is action execution. So if we assume the classic traditional Fodor view, according to which the motor system is the output channel to perform action. So in its canonical function, that is action execution, we have that the prominent motor activation, if not the most prominent motor activation, happen before the onset of an action. This is the case of the readiness potential or Berry-Shaft potential, which is a slow wave recorded with the EEG. And here the vertical line represents the onset of an action, for example, a button press. And before the onset of an action, there is the emergence of this slow wave, which reaches its maximum at the latency when the action actually starts. Now, one possibility is that we do not have actually reasons to assume that if the motor system works in this way during action execution, it behaves in a different way in a different domain, that is language or perceptual processing. And if this is the case, then is also important, because then it cannot be argued that motor system activity originates from post-semantic or post-understanding mechanism, because by definition, obviously this post-understanding mechanism should happen after a stimulus is processed and not in advance, not before the onset of the stimulus. But obviously there are more important reasons to test whether there are these anticipatory predictive signals. And one is, you are very familiar with this, more are predictive coding and free energy principles, according to which the brain generates predictions, and then by exploiting a generative internal model, which is then updated also by considering the discrepancies between prediction and the input, and then any discrepancies is then minimized by updating the beliefs in order to reduce such discrepancies. Now, here we have that usually there are two different distinct units: predictive, expectation units, and error units. Now, distinguish the activity from these units is very challenging because they are really close to each other in space. But still, it might be possible to dissociate the two processes of prediction and perception in the time domain. And this would then allow us to test two important hypotheses in this framework. First of all, that there should be top-down signals indexing prediction, and that error signaling neural responses to stimuli should scale inversely with expectation, especially in those situations in which the expectations are confirmed by the input, by the stimulus. Okay, so where one could start. Before I presented the kick and keys study. In that study, since there is also this repetitive, redundant stimulus presentation, we also looked at what happened before standard sound onset. So here, basically, I collapsed the two incongruent conditions, the solid line, that is kick in whistles and keys in footsteps. And this was the priming effect. The dotted lines are obviously here the two congruent conditions. And then after the deviance, before standard sound onset, we observed this slow waveform, which resembles the readiness potential, which was further modulated by the preceding language information. Then in a series of other studies, we also investigated different action and non-action sounds within the mismatch negativity oddball paradigm. And we always observe this drift before stimulus onset was topography was strongly modulated by the type, the nature of the standard sound tested, whether it was action related or also for beep, pure tone, we observe anticipatory activity, very lateral anticipatory activity, and sources reveal also cluster activity in proximity of the auditory areas. So one hypothesis is that these top-down signals represent sensory prediction. Now, with this data, it's probably too early to get any firm conclusion. But this, I want just to briefly mention you that this was also observed with phonemes. For example, in this mismatch negativity study, we use a very similar strategy to the kick and keys, but with phonemes. So we contrasted congruent and incongruent pairs of combinations of phonemes, where here congruency was in relation to the place of articulation, whether they were labial, lips, sounds, p, b, versus coronal, tongue sound, t, d. At the mismatch negativity, we observe a pattern which was consistent with phonological priming mediated by the place of articulation. And also in this study, with this stimuli, we observe consistent anticipatory activity before sound onset. Now, obviously, it's difficult with mismatch negativity to disentangle whether these markers are genuine indexes of prediction, because in a way, there is always some level of predictability given the very peculiar way of presenting sounds, which are redundantly repeated. So it's difficult to manipulate the amount of predictability in this paradigm. So to test whether this anticipatory activity was modulated by the level of predictability as one would expect in case are markers of predictive processing, we exploited in another study language, semantic processing. And in particular, we created affirmative, predictable sentences. So I take some grapes and I eat, or I take the pen and I write. Now, these final verbs, eat and write here, are highly predictable. That means that if we present the sentence fragments missing the final word here, and we ask participants to complete these fragments, there is a high agreement. So 80 or even 90% of participants would write here eat and write here write, the word write here. Then to manipulate the amount of predictability, we created negative, low constraint, unpredictable sentences by using the same sentences with the negation at the very beginning. So for example, I do not take some grapes and I eat, or I do not take the pen and I write. Now, in these situations, participants are not more able to expect one unique continuation here. Now, obviously, these two conditions differ both for predictability, but also for polarity, because these are obviously negative sentences and these are affirmative sentences. So to control for the effect of negation, we created a further control conditions, always the same sentences, but with the negation at the very end. So I take some grapes, but I do not eat, or I take the pen, but I do not write. Here, participants were again able to indicate one unique continuation of these fragments presented without the final target word. So we created many sentences like this per each of these, for all these conditions. The final words were always action verbs, and half were face-related verbs, eat, talk, drink, and the other half were hand-related words, write, grasp, and so on. All the sentences were presented acoustically through earphones while participants were distracted with a silent movie, because we were here mostly interested in automatic processing. So it was very passive conditions, no task at all involved, just passive listening without paying attention to the stimuli. And are these top-down signals related to predictive processing? Well, here after sentence fragments, but before word onset, we observed that the two predictable conditions, both the affirmative and the negative predictable conditions, elicited these anticipatory predictive signals, which was substantially larger as compared to the unpredictable condition. Furthermore, before word onset, we also revealed that depending on the expected verbs, we observe greater activity in a more ventral position in source space for face-related expectations as compared to hand-related expectation, which in turn elicited greater activity in a more dorsal position. Now, obviously, this was done with action-related words, but as I told you before at the very beginning of this presentation, one would expect the contribution of posterior, ventral areas in case of non-action, but concrete, visually related words. So we also then tested whether these anticipatory predictive signals emerge from these different classes of stimulus, and that so to discriminate whether this anticipatory signal is just related to action processing. And in this study, so it was a very simple design, 2 by 2, predictable, unpredictable, and the final word could either be animal noun, eagle, which has been shown by previous study that participants, when are presented with these words, there is also a contribution of visual, posterior ventral visual brain areas. Or the final word could be also tool, so the action-related condition, tool noun. So it was 2 by 2, predictable, unpredictable, last word, animal or tools. Then we created, as before, many sentences for all these 4 conditions, and these were acoustically presented through earphones, while participants were distracted with a silent movie. So it was a very passive condition, and also the movie was completely unrelated to these stimuli, obviously. What we observed, as before, so the predictable here in magenta elicited larger anticipatory activity before final word onset as compared to the unpredictable conditions, which in turn elicited a larger N400 as compared to the predictable condition. Now, this specific pattern of activity that is larger predictive signals for predictable than unpredictable, but larger N400 for unpredictable than predictable, was equally present across the two for both our semantic categories, animal and tool nouns. And we also observed that, that this signal was related to predictive processing was further confirmed with correlation analysis, showing significant correlations between objective measure of predictability, so corpus-based co-occurrence measure, and a subjective report of predictability. Here, each dot represents one sentence and is the average of all the participants per, for all the sentences tested in this study. Now, regarding the other important hypothesis, that is error signaling neural responses to stimuli should scale inversely with expectation. Interestingly, in this study, we also observe at sentence level. So again, here each dot is one sentence and is the average of all participants for that sentence. We observe negative correlations between the predictive signals and N400, and we observe it for a different channels location, both frontal electrode and the parietal electrode, which are particularly important for the N400 amplitude component. Sorry. Okay, and finally, we also look at the semantic discriminatory function of the anticipatory predictive signal, the prediction potential, and the N400, and both before word onset and at the N400 latencies, we observe the contribution also of modality preferential brain areas, and in particular, more prefrontal motor in case of tool nouns as compared to animal nouns, which vice versa show greater activity in posterior ventral visual brain areas. Okay, so we have something that looks a lot like the readiness potential. There are several similarities between these two signals. They both are slow wave with negative polarity, with a broad scalp distribution. So there might be the possibilities that these two signals represent a very similar role in their respective domain, that is prediction of the next critical event, which would be action for the readiness potential, action execution in a given context, and stimulus processing in case of the prediction potential and the word, the passive experiment. And this would also be relevant, I think, but I mean, we can discuss also later in the framework of predictive coding theories and the free energy principles, because also in this context, action itself is guided by prediction and predictive processing. So to start to test this hypothesis, because obviously this would require several experiments, it's not that easy, but we started from one specific experiment, which is usually a very good strategy to starting from somewhere. And in particular, we use the same here, we use the same design of the last study I presented with animal and tools, predictable, unpredictable. So the 2x2 design, very simple. And the comprehension experiment was basically the same of the previous study. Just here, the difference is that we asked participants to pay attention to the stimuli to match the production experiment, but otherwise it was the same procedure. So we presented all these sentences through earphones, and they were passive listening of this stimulation. Then in the production experiment, we presented the same sentences, but missing the final noun, either animal or tool, which was replaced with a pure tone, a beep sound. And participants here were instructed to wait the beep and then to pronounce the word they would expect as a continuation of the preceding sentence fragment. Now, with the production experiment, basically it was a closed task during EEG. And indeed, we confirmed that our sentences were well distinct for the level of predictability. And also, we were able to measure the reaction times. Here was computed as the interval between the beep and the speech onset per each trial and each participant. And as you can see, we observe a very large effect of predictability of, on average, about 300 milliseconds. Participants were faster completing the predictable sentences than the unpredictable ones. Okay, so what the results show is that for the comprehension experiment, as before, we observe larger predictive signals before word onset for the predictable than unpredictable conditions. And the same pattern was observed also in the production experiment. Here we focus on two different latencies before beep onset, so the go signal, and align to speech onset. So here we align trial by trial, participant by participant, the EG to the speech onset. And in both cases, we observe larger anticipatory activity for the predictable high constraint conditions than the unpredictable condition. Then source estimations here for the two modalities for the critical comparison, predictable against unpredictable in the two modalities, showed similar clusters of activity, thus showing that these two modalities rely on a shared predictive mechanism, might rely on a shared predictive mechanism in the two modalities. And also the semantic clusters, motor in case of tools and posterior visual in case of animals, as I showed you in the previous studies, were observed before speech onset and in production, and before word onset in comprehension in both modalities at these critical latencies. Okay, finally, also correlation analysis here revealed that both anticipatory signals correlated with close probability and with reaction times, and also there was correlations between the two. Again, this was done at sentence level, so each dot is one sentence and one trial, and was the average of all the participants for that trial. Okay, so to conclude, I show you some evidences that semantic priming is something that can happen also in the motor system, especially when the relevant information is action related. Another important instance case of predictability, of flexibility is predictability, and we have these anticipatory predictive signals which is modulated by the amount of predictability, and also reveal aspects, semantic aspects of the expected item, stimulus, the inverse correlations between the prediction potential, the predictive signal, and the subsequent N400 might index that the N400 might, that these two indexes suggest the correlation that these two responses have a similar semantic discriminatory function, and in particular that the N400 might functionally depend on the preceding prediction potential. So in these terms might be considered a prediction error response. And also that I show you more fresh data here that in both modalities rely on similar mechanisms, on similar distributed networks supporting both language processing and predictive processing in language domain. In general, I mean, I want to conclude by saying that these results contradict the idea that sensorimotor activity and general activity, the contribution of modality preferential brain areas in language processing are epiphenomenal and post-understanding mechanisms, because these would not explain the role, the active role they show in anticipating future events. So I want to thank you for your attention, and please let me also give a special thanks to Professor Friedman Purbermüller, that has been my mentor for nearly 15 years in Berlin, who suddenly and sadly passed away a few months ago. And it has been a huge loss for me and for many other colleagues in Berlin, in Cambridge, and elsewhere. And I also take this opportunity to thank my new colleagues in Favela, Luciano Fadiga, Alessandro D'Ausilio, and the very big, large group in which I'm working now, which is a really great environment to do research. And thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Luigi, for the presentation. So
I hope it was clear.
Yeah,
Do
yeah.
you have okay?
Yeah, now if there are like any questions or comments from anyone on the chat, like feel free to raise your hand. And I was curious when you were mentioning the two hypotheses. You were saying, well, can we index this predictive processing, this top-down prediction path, and on the other side, can we clarify something about where those like predictions errors are happening? And I'm just curious about whether what kind of claims can be made, for instance, regarding prediction errors, because usually those are quite tricky because they can be like implemented on two, as you were saying, like two especially connected neurons. In some cases, it's also said that could be just within a single neuron at a dendritic level, for instance, combining that top-down and bottom-up signal.
Yeah, it's very difficult, obviously, especially with, at least for me, for the methodology I use with EEG, is very difficult. A part of the semantic differentiation for the semantic categories, our main goal with this study was, first of all, to try to separate and see whether it's possible to separate in a time domain the two processes of anticipation and perception. And I think there is still a lot to do in this perspective. For example, maybe I was a bit fast before, but this is also why we use, oh, sorry, there was a notification. Okay. Can you see my PowerPoint, even if it's not?
Yeah. Can see
yeah. So here, for example, we use a silence interval as a strategy to try to minimize as much as possible the also contextual, perceptual brain activations from the contextual, so from the preceding words. this might be considered also a strategy, to obviously, which is not very ecological, and to introduce such a silence. It's also true that in language, I mean, gaps of 1 second might happen and actually frequently happen. But this was mostly, done to try to see whether in the time domain we can split the two processes of prediction and perception. And then obviously, I mean, test very specific spatial question with EG. It's not easy, apart of, for example, looking at large difference between, for example, prefrontal motor versus posterior visual brain areas, which is what we can do in a way with the spatial resolution of the EEG technique, which is limited, obviously. For I don't know whether I answered your question. Or...
Yeah, no. I mean, I was expecting. Yeah, it's not actually like the purpose of this study. But since you mentioned it, I was curious whether you had like that question in mind, or what could you be extracted, or what could you hypothesize or maybe speculate about that. But yeah, I get it's
Yeah,
like quite tricky methodologically speaking as well.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you for your question.
So if there are any questions or comments in the chat, yeah, feel free to raise your hand. Um, okay. If there are no further comments, then I guess maybe you can move to you, Carl.
Yes, good.
Hmm.
Is it my turn now?
Yeah, it seems so.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, Luigi. That was an encyclopedic overview of sort of decades of work. Very, very impressive. And I was a bit shocked. I didn't know that Frederick Pulvermuller had died.
Yeah,
So I wasn't aware of that.
yeah. It happened suddenly. Yeah, last October. Yeah, it was
Right.
unexpected. Yeah, for me, it's been. I mean, for me, for us, it has been really, yeah, sad, and it's still sad. So, but yeah,
Yes, I'll have to find out whether people like Kathy Price, my colleague, in the language group in the UK, knew about that. That is unexpected
yeah,
because he used to be at the CBU in Cambridge before moving to Berlin.
yeah,
So
yeah,
he
yeah.
was quite a close colleague many, many years ago. Um, right. Okay. Well, my condolences. It must have been a great shock to you as well,
Yeah,
personally.
yeah,
Um, Right. Well,
thank
again,
you.
thank you for the presentation. I'm going to sort of you presented too much for me to sort of summarize or feedback on. So what I
Yeah, so
do is just congratulate you on this work and the overall direction of travel in terms of trying to um, debunk or at least revise some of these 20th century models and move towards this grounded action perception theory, which clearly is much more consistent with predictive processing and indeed in terms of action perception theory, of course, active inference as an application of predictive processing, and I think most easily interpreted in terms of predictive coding as a particular neuronal instantiation of this sort of action perception uh, perspective on everything that we do and sense, including language and communication. So for me, I'll just cut to what I think is a really interesting question that your results raise in my mind, and it's very specific, and I'll address what that question is in a second. But before I do that, what I will then do is just take you through a couple of papers that I thought you might be interested in if you haven't already read them or come across them, that would, I think, sort of provide potentially useful points of contact or references in the computational literature that speak to some of your arguments. They may or may not be useful. The reason I've chosen the particular papers was, to a certain extent, a reflection of your conversation, or was reflected in your conversation in the question and answer period about, what is the neurophysiological process that would best explain these results that functionally can be understood in terms of predictive coding, and how can one interpret the ERP or the event-related potentials in relation to the underlying microcircuitry and functional architectures of the sources that you've been studying. And one answer to that, I think, is that it foregrounds the potential for, or the potential importance of, simulating these responses, both in terms of action and perception, in silico, by actually implementing a Kalman filter or predictive coding scheme in a biologically plausible way, just to see what it would look like. And I think then you're in a position of, having created an actual model of what's going on, you can ask questions. Does this require a separate population of error encoding neurons? How much does it depend upon expectation and postsynaptic gain of these neurons? Is it a single neuron? Is it a population? There are all sorts of really interesting questions. I suspect not the particular questions that you're in a position to answer, because you're still in the sort of the foundations of the cognitive neuroscience aspect of this. But I think in the future does speak to the importance of being now able to use the predictive coding formalism to build models of these paradigms and see what are the important parameters and the important contexts that are best, the best explanation for these really interesting results. So that's what my focus will be on, just to point to a couple of papers that simulate things like the N400, that simulate these sort of context sensitive effects, just to show, to illustrate how important they can be, not only in revealing certain aspects of predictive processing in language comprehension and production, but also in providing sort of formal observation models that allow you now to put those models to the data and ask, what's the best explanation? Where, how can I understand the implicit computations or message passing? The particular question which intrigues me, and I don't expect an answer, but it certainly intrigues me, is rests upon something that you highlighted about 70% of the way through your talk, which is the precise nature of this predictive signal, this sort of generalization of Bereitschaft signal, or a contingent negative variation, or this reflection of some either anticipatory or perceptual set that predates the actual onset of the signal. And I like the fact you called it sort of, a predictive signal. But of course, the question then is, what is being predicted? And I asked that question in the context of one understanding of predictive coding, which is the minimization of precision-weighted prediction errors. And that's something which I think is often very underappreciated in cognitive neuroscience, that when we look at evoked responses, we're not looking at the prediction error. We're looking at the prediction error that is weighted by its precision. So if I find this kind of prediction error which I can interpret as the newsworthy information, sensory information, and it's newsworthy because I could not predict it. How much attention do I afford that particular, how much credence do I afford that newsworthy information that is a prediction error, that is itself dependent upon the perceptual set or the predictive set or anticipatory set that has been set up by my preceding experience. So I'm framing this in terms of there is a dual challenge for prediction. Not only do I have to predict what I'm going to hear, but I also have to predict its predictability. And in my world, that's the prediction of the precision. And you can now read the precision as, if you like, the mathematical homologue of attentional gain. And this could be exogenous or endogenous. It could be, local mechanisms reflecting the signal to noise ratio in the environment in accord with Weber's law, or it could be some very endogenous effect that you've carefully cued, such as in the Posner paradigm. In your case, because you're using a mismatch negativity-like paradigm or a hailing paradigm. I should just explain for people listening to the recording, or I'm reading your paradigm with the closed probabilities as a hailing paradigm where you violate the expectation of the last word by setting up a context with a particular sentence. In exactly the same way that you are in the mismatch negativity paradigm, setting up a particular context of predictability by the preceding standards, and then you violate those expectations with the oddball or the deviant stimulus. The key point I'm trying to make here is that predictions of predictability are very distinct from the predictions of the content. And I think much of the elegance of your design rests upon that. You're manipulating the predictability independently of the actual content. That could be an oddball or a standard, or it could be modality congruent, or it could be sort of a face or a limb kind of content. And if that is the case, if there are two pressures or aspects of prediction, then the question, am I predicting the predictability or the precision, which I will then subsequently use to weight my prediction errors, or am I predicting the content that I'm going to use to form the prediction error? So that's basically the question that I was asking myself. And of course, it's very difficult to empirically answer that question, because of course the actual content is only surprising in relation to the context that is afforded a certain precision or predictability. However, it's still, to my mind, a really important question to ask. Is it the precision or is it the prediction error? When you can only measure the precision-weighted prediction error. I don't know if that makes sense, but hopefully I'll be able to unpack that.
No. Can you hear me? Because here and there I had some problem with the audio. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, I can hear you well now, yes.
Oh, okay, good. Yes and no, because I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I follow you completely for the mismatch negativity part, where there are violations and so on. But if we look at these sentences, for example, the emblem of Germany is the eagle. So in this specific case, we have that eagle becomes predictable in this context. So in a way, if we ask participants to complete this sentence fragment, the emblem of Germany is the 80, 90%, here you can see the percentage, of participants will use always one word, the same word, eagle. So these might be considered, maybe I'm wrong or I misunderstood some, some of your argument, but might be considered the fact that they are also predicting something about what is arriving. What I'm not convinced in general by the literature is that there is this tendency to think that is the next word, which is expected as a whole, because it might be possible that some aspect of the word are expected. For example, if we take the network model, so if we conceive a word represented as a distributed network, it might be possible that in when we anticipate, predict, in this context, we do by starting from a sub part of the word. So those features, semantic features, for example, which then ignite the full word, but this might be already considered as a secondary process. I want to give you a very stupid example. For example, if imagine these sentences here in a poetry, I would think that the predictive machine will start to anticipate or predict also rhymes, not only meaning. And that context would add another piece of prediction to the story. So a piece of word form trying to resembling another preceding contextual word to have rhymes, because in poetry we expect rhymes and so on. So I don't know whether it was clear, my point, but that it might be possible is a speculation for now. I wrote a very short opinion paper a few years ago, trying to argue that maybe in these situations, there might be possible that specific aspect, meaning semantic level in case of semantic processing, are particularly expected. Then when these features belong to one specific word, then that word becomes predictable. But this is, I mean, in a way, it's a speculation. But what I was just wanted to say is that, I mean, in a sentence here we have that the close probability explain in a way or seems to match very well the electrophysiological result. And in this case, we have also the information that participant expected a specific word, no? So, whereas I follow you fully for the mismatch negativity completely, for the sentence paradigm, I think there is also indication that is the at least some aspect of the next word are pre-activated, so the content also, or at least some aspect of the content.
Yes, that's I think that's a very good point, and I agree with you entirely. And I had in mind that pre-activation was use the same kind of precision weighting mechanism. So at any level of analysis, be it semantic or phonological, so you could have presented the words in the visual domain in a false font or an unusual font, for example. So I think you're absolutely right that these arguments have to be unpacked at each level of analysis. But within a level of analysis, I think the way that I would model what you've just said is that if I've got a sentence that with a very high probability limits the number of possible things that could happen. So, for example, the constraint afforded by the emblem of Germany is the thing. I know immediately now it's not going to be a chicken, it's not going to be a hammer, it's not going to. So a whole load of options are now, if you like, effectively ignored. You remove the precision from those representations so that you're attending to a subset that have a high probability. So I was sort of absorbing the predictability of the content into the contextual restriction of what could possibly happen. I don't know what's actually going to happen until it actually arrives, but I can certainly preempt and predict the most likely space of things that are arriving. And of course, that I think that could also be interpreted. I'm actually predicting the content because I'm restricting the latitude of things that I predict are going to actually happen. And I think that is another way of saying it's very difficult to disentangle the predictions of predictability from the predictions of the content, because the content is the things that are predictable. So it is
exactly.
a very difficult thing to actually disentangle. Michael, did you have?
Yes, can I say just something which is a little bit distant, but it's very interesting, all that you've been saying, particularly, Carl, the last few minutes, because I've always been very impressed with Hewlings Jackson. He always said that all thought was composed of movement. And actually, Coleridge said that before him. And I'm wondering what this has to do with what you were talking about, Carl, of what comes before. Actually, before comes the thought. And I'm wondering if some things that you're saying might say something about the interest that people have in what is a thought, as opposed to what is a movement. But the idea that you can have a thought which is not filled with something to do with a movement. I don't know whether that solves anything to do with the interesting things you were saying, Carl, but it is very fascinating that you have a thought and then you stop. I better not say that, or you lose it, or another thought comes in and interferes with things. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the processes that you're talking about, what is it that ignites the full word? I think were the words you used, or Carl, you said the predictors of the content. I'm just wondering what has to do with thinking and thoughts, which is probably much more significant in the world of Homo sapiens than it is necessarily reading or whatever. I just wonder what thoughts might come into your thoughts.
Yeah, very nice, very interesting question. Homo sapiens, also because we have language in a way. So, and we know from linguistic relativity that there is an intricate and very important relationship between thought and language. And also, for example, in the linguistic relativity, also has been shown how language can modify the perceptual abilities. For example, there are languages, Italian languages, that uses different words for different kind of blues. We have azzurro, celeste, blue. Vice versa, there are words such as German or English that doesn't make this distinction. It's light blue, dark blue. And it's been revealed that actually participants with words that have this differentiation are also, with the mismatch negativity, also behavior better in discriminating the colors itself. So this is more at the perceptual level, but is an example of how language interact with other systems and thought as well. In this specific, in relation for my specific studies, is obviously a strong implication is memory and knowledge. Mm-hmm. Because as an Italian, the emblem of Germany is I'm not immediately ready to say eagle, but as a German, obviously you are more because you have that knowledge, and vice versa with other Italian. And in this case, yes, is the interplay between also knowledge and language that can explain, that is important, because in a way this anticipatory predictive signal might be also considered as a way how memory expresses, which was also the idea of Fuster in that very nice paper, Past Makes Future, which is the role of memory in anticipation and prediction.
Thank you.
I don't know whether I replied, but I can't say more than that, because it's a very fascinating but also very complex topic.
Thank you.
So is this the Fuster of perception action cycle that you were? Yeah, no, I think so. That's nice, because in answer to Michael's question, I read the question really as a nod to ideomotor theory, which I think is my favorite sort of version of active inference in the 19th century. I think it's absolutely right, where it's all the same thing. The thought, the idea is the act, and the act is the in the sense of the circular causality implied by the Fuster's action perception cycle. It's all the same thing, and it's a process that unfolds at different time scales, where the slower time scales, say, of language would certainly enslave and contextualize the faster processes of sort of phonemic analysis, right down to sort of cochlear dynamics. Michael, so did you have in mind ideomotor theory, or was that too historical?
Well, no, I had no idea actually of any particular theory, except that thinking and thoughts are left out of many things that people look out when it comes to language. And because the language comes on, but you always come with thoughts. But Hewlings-Jackson was clear you couldn't have a thought without having a motor action, or at least an intent to do something. And I think not enough people concentrate on thoughts, as opposed to what's further down the line when you put your thought into an action. And I thought I just picked up the things you were saying, Carl, but when you said ignites the full, no, somebody said, no, you said predicted the content. And am I predicting what I'm going to say next in my thoughts, which I had on while I was listening to you giving the presentation?
Yes. Well, my point of view, absolutely, you are predicting what you're going to say, and if you didn't, you wouldn't say it.
Exactly. That's exactly. Yeah.
Which is how I read ideomotor theory, both of the Germanic sort and the William James's sort. Yeah, the intention to move,
Yes.
is of course where it all starts. But on the other hand, coming back to the action perception cycle, the intention to move is a response to your past inferences. So it's very difficult to put the chicken before the egg, before the chicken before the egg. But so for me, it's it's an ongoing process that necessarily involves ideation and thought and intentions. I think intentions are really very important. Very important. Right. Sorry. Let me. If I can share the screen, I'll just try and unpack what I was intimating in terms of.
I interrupted my sharing, so.
Oh, right. Good. So if I can do that and then share. Good. But what I'm particularly interested in is, I'm particularly interested in this simulation here. That the particular thing that occurred to me when looking at your final results was this really compelling inverse relationship, sort of a yin yang between the predictive, the PP part, the anticipatory part, that went hand in hand with an attenuation of the, say, surprise or precision weighted prediction error component of the or later components of the event related potential. And that is exactly what you would expect if the PP part was preparing and predicting because it is a predictable sentence, or it's a predictable paradigm. The machinery that is responsible for evaluating the actual prediction error. So that, another way of expressing that is that if I can predict to a certain extent what is going to happen next, I am going to be less surprised when something happens. And if I'm less surprised when something happens, I have a smaller precision weighted prediction error, and therefore the greater the preparatory or anticipatory, or the sort of the pre-stimulus prediction or electrophysiological correlates of the prediction, then I would expect an attenuation of the prediction error or precision weighted prediction error in and of itself. And that seemed to me exactly what you were showing, and you showed it in a number of different ways in terms of the negative correlations, for example. That seemed to be a really important point, and it's something that certainly emerges when you simulate predictive processing in this hierarchical generative model that we were implicitly talking about, with the separation of temporal scales and a circular sort of message passing, but also an action perception cycle going on overall. And the closest that we have come across, or the closest that the thing that we have done purely in terms of simulating by instantiating Kalman filtering or predictive coding in the context of sentences that have different kinds of violation is reported in this figure here. So what we did is simulate, using a predictive coding like scheme, responses to different words. In this example, they're actually presented iconographically as opposed to in the auditory domain. But the key thing is that we simulated a violation of the actual expected word, the semantic, and simulated a violation of the modality, so using sort of false fonts, if you like, without violating the semantic aspect of it. So speaking exactly to your two levels here. And then if you simulate these things, described in this as a sort of global violation of a semantic sort versus a local violation lower down in the generative model of a more, say, phonetic sort or a more false font sort, then one can demonstrate results that look very, very similar to yours, in the sense that there is an attenuation of early and late components, depending upon whether the violation of expectations or predictions is at the local, say, phonological level versus at the global semantic level, depending upon the predictions that you've set up with the preceding sentence. And just looking at the sort of your results, they coincide. Well, these simulation results coincide very nicely with the time constants of what you were demonstrating in terms of these sort of late global semantic violations and what could have been predicted or what was predicted, that are reflected in these sort of earlier preparatory fluctuations. So I thought that this was a nice verification of not only your results, but also the interpretation of the results that comes purely from Bayes optimal integration of a sort of predictive processing scheme. As I say, this is using sort of visual stimuli, but interpreting the belief updating, the message passing in a way that sort of enables you to interpret it in terms of the kind of electrophysiological results that you might expect to see, with a bit of functional anatomy there. So if that was of interest in terms of just saying that the phenomenology electrophysiologically that you've shown is extremely consistent with purely with purely theoretical simulation results, then this paper may be of interest. Entitled Deep Temporal Models and Active Inference. So you've got your action perception and the active inference. And I think the deep here speaks to what we were just talking about, that we have to have this generative model that has a deep hierarchical structure to get the separation of temporal scales and the kind of coarse graining that you'd require in order to be able to contextualize the next word in the context of a phrase, contextualize a phrase in the context of a sentence, and so on. So again, just speaking to that conversation with Michael, that all of this depends upon a higher context, which itself has to be predicted. So I thought you might like that. One practical thing that comes from this kind of simulation is ways of measuring or quantifying the amplitude of the waveform, the ERP, and of course its differences in terms of things like the mismatch negativity. But if we just sort of focus on the waveform, say the P300, one thing which emerges when you actually simulate predictive processing of language stimuli in the context of it being more or less predictable is that the amplitude of the ERP seems very, very tightly correlated with something known as a KL divergence or Bayesian surprise. So if you can work out a probability distribution over what you expect as reflected in your PP pre-stimulus responses, and then you evaluate that probability distribution over what you expect after you've actually heard the word. You can mathematically measure the KL divergence or the relative entropy of those probability distributions. And that is a ubiquitous measure of the change in the information or the information gain that you have when you actually hear the word. And of course, that's going to depend upon the precision with which you made a prediction. So if I predicted exactly it was going to be an eagle because it's going to be the emblem of Germany, then when I hear an eagle, there's a very small KL divergence or information gain. I have to change, if you want to talk about this in terms of Bayesian filtering, this quantity, this KL divergence or information gain is literally the distance or how much I have to move my prior beliefs, which are set up with the PP, to my posterior beliefs after a posteriori I've actually heard the word. And of course, if my prior beliefs are already close to my posterior beliefs, I have to move less, and therefore the information gain is less, and therefore the KL divergence is less, and therefore there is less energy expended in encoding the changes in my belief, and therefore the amplitude of the mismatch negativity, the mismatch of this waveform component starts to decrease. And that seemed to be exactly what you were showing. One interesting interpretation of this KL divergence, this information gain, is something in the visual search literature called Bayesian surprise. So in the visual search literature, people try to understand where will I saccade to next. So it's very much action perception, it's active sensing. So this is not about the response to the stimulus. It's before I see the stimulus, where do I look for it? And what people tend to do is to act in a way to attend to or to sample those parts of the sensorium that have the greatest expected information gain. So they, in anticipation or conditioned upon the action, we can work out how much information will I gain, how much will I have to move my beliefs, if I was able to get the information that might be over there. And this is called Bayesian surprise in the visual search literature. So the expected information gain that I was just talking about that depends upon your prior beliefs also underwrites Bayesian surprise in the visual search literature. I don't think you need to tell that story because your story, I think, is very clear. The very fact that I set things up to know roughly what was going to happen means I have to do less belief updating and therefore, by Landau's principle, expend less metabolic or thermodynamic energy in order to update my beliefs to my posterior beliefs once I actually hear eagle. And therefore, I expect to see a less deflection in a smaller or attenuated evoked response. So this paper simulates this process, specifically trying to ask, what would it look like if I was able to actually measure the ERPs of this synthetic brain processing language, where I can set up, this is quite a detailed simulation of segmentation of phonology that uses very much in the spirit we were just talking about, what I expect and what I have learned about the semantic structure of a sentence that enables me to now test different hypotheses about different ways of segmenting phonemes. and that basically using the sort of top-down prior now to select the right segmentation that then provides evidence for my prior belief that I was listening to this word or that word, and simulate in the context of sort of providing different streams of words and then violating those words at the end just to measure the effect on the amplitude of the synthetic ERPs, and that that's the important result, that the Bayesian surprise or the KL divergence in natural units, because it's usually using natural logarithms, linearly explains the evoked power of the response, the squared amplitude of the response, which I thought would be another interesting technical interpretation of your results, because you've now also got the measure of Bayesian surprise, because you know how surprised the subject would be, because you're controlling the predictability with the sentence that you're using to elicit or contextualize the evoked response. So yeah, there's lots of detail in this paper which is not interesting for you, but I thought that final result might be interesting, just the final discussion of that, and that's in a paper called Active Listening in Hearing Research with Kathy and Emma Holmes, who's one of our key people. So practically, I thought that might be another interesting perspective on quantifying or explaining why you get this sort of yin-yang that you described in in a number of ways, either in terms of the ERPs, but also the negative correlations that you were showing. It makes entire sense, not just from the point of view of predictive coding, but more generally Bayesian belief updating in the brain, where you've got prior beliefs that you set up through presenting the right context and the right sort of word stream to actually contextualize the outcome. So I thought you might like that. This is, I'll just quickly go through these because the rest of them are less directly interesting from your point of view. But for completeness, I'll just quickly run through them. This was a simulation using explicitly predictive coding with Harriet Feldman, showing that one could interpret this kind of precision weighting as attention, as modeled in this is using the Posner paradigm. So I know that you haven't used the Posner paradigm, but in a sense, you are setting up expectations about where in semantic space is the next word going to be. So it has some sort of conceptual links to manipulations of endogenous attention that would then invoke these baseline shifts that might be apparent in the PP contingent negative variation that you're showing. And of course, the consequences of when the stimulus actually arrives are also expressed in terms of how surprised you are in terms of simulated or real P300 and P1 effects. So this is a slightly different angle that may allow you to tell a story about endogenous attention and novelty detection and the different was it P3B and P3A in relation to sort of the Posner paradigm in this particular instance. It also talks about sort of more simple bias competition models, but I think this is something that was done a long time ago, but it did some of your results did remind me of really interesting questions about how do you explain fluctuations in evoked responses before the stimulus has arrived, in terms, and how might that be expressed behaviorally in terms of false alarms and false rejections and the like, in an ambiguous perception paradigm. And these authors, first one, Guido Hesselmann and Andreas Kleinschmidt, sort of told a story which is not dissimilar to the story you're telling, but more in terms of, again, this notion of how can we understand how we implement priors that we have accumulated on the basis of recent expectation. How can we instantiate those priors physiologically, and what effect do they have on the underlying both electrophysiological responses and the, in this instance, the behavioral responses. This was actually done with fMRI, so it's not going to be directly comparable to your work, but I thought you might be interested in that. I can't remember why I put this up. I'm just quickly having a look through now to remind myself. Oh, yeah. Another way of characterizing the electrophysiological or the ERP or the electrophysiological data in these certainly in auditory work is to actually look at not the event-related responses but the induced responses by looking at different frequencies. And I'm just saying that literature is there should you be interested, because there's some interesting both simulation work but also empirical work that associates the top-down part of the predictive bit, which you would presumably associate with the PP, pre-stimulus component, with slower frequencies than the ascending prediction errors at higher, usually gamma frequencies. So you might expect there to be, again, a yin-yang between the prevalence of slow fluctuations, say in beta or theta. In fact, the theta might actually be the bright shaft sort of frequency domain, and the amplitude of gamma stimulus evoked gamma responses, which would be another electrophysiological signature of the effect that you were describing. And this paper focuses on these more frequency specific correlates in terms of the nonlinear coupling you get when you start to violate expectations in these deep generative models. Yeah, so no deep in this one, but again, using simulations to try and predict what you might see if you're able to actually measure the system doing this kind of inference. I put these two things up here, these two papers up here right at the beginnings, because you were talking about, well, I imagined you were going to talk about sort of chunking and coarse graining and representing words as opposed to sort of acoustic streams in a continuous sense. And I think, again, that's absolutely right. And in most generative models that I'm familiar with, there's always this sort of, as you get deeper and deeper and deeper into your generative models that's doing the grounded action perception processing, things go from being continuous sort of frequency glides and continuous signals, and they become discrete and much more coarse-grained. And when you simulate that, you actually have to sort of move from a continuous state-space model to a discrete state-space model. And this paper just describes how you can do that in terms of the underlying maths and the simulations, if you're interested. It's talking about the difference between predictive coding at the continuous level versus belief propagation as you get higher and higher into these deep generative models. But the underlying maths and message passing is formally exactly the same. And then finally, one of my favorite papers with Chris Frith was just to endorse your action perception grounding perspective, that just using the same generative model to either listen or to talk. It can't be any other way, especially when you think that you're actually listening and talking to somebody else who's doing exactly the same thing with the same generative model. And this just simulates the basic mechanics using predictive coding in this instance, with two birds singing to each other, and when they can hear each other, evincing technically what's called a sort of generalized synchronization, again with sort of simulated electrophysiology at a higher level and then a lower level here. Not relevant directly for your argument, but certainly from my perspective, an active inference perspective, it cannot be any other way. It has to be like this. And that's it. That's all I had to feed back. So I'll stop sharing now.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I knew some paper, but I will definitely look. And actually came to me, I mean, another things that I don't know whether we have time, but just very briefly, in one study I presented, because I think this could be actually important for the beliefs revision and already at the predictive latency, because we have the affirmative predictable sentences. I go to the blackboard and I write. Then we had a negated predictable. So I go to the blackboard, but I do not write. Now, what interesting, I didn't present today because I didn't want to go too much into the detail of the study, but in that specific study, we also have a condition of violations of expectations. That means that each sentence was presented twice, one with the expected item and another one with the unexpected item. Interestingly, what we observe is that in the affirmative predictable and in the negative predictable condition, we had the similar anticipatory activity, but the violations just occurred more prominently in the affirmative conditions, but not in the negative condition. At that time, it was 10 years ago, we interpreted this as a potential ability of the brain to compute possible alternatives over the negated one, which could be a sort of already updating the belief so that then the next stimulus in a negated context is less, in a way, violating than in the affirmative one. This, I don't know whether it was a good interpretation. I mean, more work would be necessary there, but it might be related also to an online belief updating already during when the contextual no is negated. Obviously, yeah, it's not happening what I expect, but I might expect alternatives, possible alternatives.
Yeah, that sounds very compelling. Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of a work with Steve Fleming and Matan Meza, which is how do we infer something is not there? It's extremely difficult to do that because, as you say, so I'm not going to write, which means there's an infinite number of things that I could be doing. So suddenly you're back in this unconstrained. And how does the brain sort of cope with this? Oh, it's not that. So what is it? I think it's a really interesting interpretation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very, very much for this meeting. And I don't know whether.
Well, yes, he normally makes us clap now, so that's probably what's going to happen.
So waiting for that. Thank you so much, Luigi, and thank you, Carl, as always. And thank you, everyone. Let's give a round of applause to Luigi. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you next time.
And may I say just briefly one thing? I was very happy to be here because obviously Freestone work has been really important for me over the year to read it. And thank you again for having me here today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.